Julien, Laroche and I are conducting research in the sound domain at the Research and Development Laboratory of a company called Acoustic Arts. Our works leads us to think the dynamics of interaction that are at play in musical contexts, especially during improvisation. We more specifically study improvisation in a pedagogical setting. According to Stigler and since Plato, teaching is the primary issue of philosophy. We thus raise this issue through case studies in music pedagogy, and we do so by analyzing interactive improvisation. We define our own pedagogical device as a system of care. It thus articulates the different organological levels: the corporeal organ, by which the subject involves himself individually; the technical organ, that is the milieu of communication; the social organ, which in our case is the process of interaction between the learner and the teacher.
So the pedagogical situation we propose is relevant if we are to observe the individuation process. As we will show, not only can the subject experience the articulation between these levels by himself from a first-person point of view, but we can also observe and experiment with this articulation from a third-person point of view, I mean scientifically. Since music is constituted by its own temporality, individuation of the learner actually coincides with the temporal unfolding of the performance itself. So, in other words, the dynamics of the musical object coincide with the dynamics of the experience of that very object as lived by the subject. But further, it also coincides with the dynamics of the interaction between the learner and the teacher. That is, it coincides with collective dynamics, which is the second-person point of view. So such an articulation between first, second, and third-person points of view allows us to verify that our pedagogical setting is actually facilitating the individuation process. We will tackle the issue of individuation through two main concepts. We call them spontaneous achievement zones and core tastes, and we will illustrate these concepts by case studies. So we will listen to a bit of music. Here we discuss this work, at least today, in the light of general organology. So according to Bernard Stiegler, pour une nouvelle critique de l'économie politique, the human subject has to handle bodily, technical, and social organological levels, at the heart of which individuation becomes possible. In our case, the bodily organ is the learner, the technical organ is constituted by the piano and the music itself, and the social organ is the interaction that the learner has with the teacher when they improvise together. A system of care is constituted when the technical organ can individuate both the bodily level and the collective level, as proposed by Bernard Stiegler pour une nouvelle critique de l'économie politique. In our pedagogical device, a system of care is constituted when the musical level co-individuates both the teacher and the learner. We actually observe so, and we see that during the interactive improvisations that we study, this actually happens. So in this system of care, the learner is involved in the co-creation of shared meanings.
Our pedagogical system of care is a revolution in the sense of Stiegler, pour une nouvelle critique de l'économie politique, page 69-71. Stiegler sees in reticular capitalism the possibility of creating moments of deprioritized experiences. During those moments, the technical organ encourages the individuation of the other two levels. This is possible because capitalism entails externalities, that is, effects that its own organization do not manage, freeware, social networks, etc. We aim at thinking and enacting deprioritized experiences from the pedagogical relation of our device. Here, we focus on free interactive improvisation, which is the very heart of our pedagogical device. They are performed by two interacting persons, the learner and his teacher. Our system of thought consists in pedagogical techniques and concepts that allow to describe improvisation processes. Phases of synchrony and diachrony, which accounts for the coordination between the learner and the teacher. Actions, validating or blocking the other's performance, which regulate the dynamics of interaction. And tendencies, spontaneous achievement zones and core tastes, which account for the dynamics that orient activity and lived experience. Those dynamics can either be intrinsic to the subject or emerge from the interactions with others. We will exemplify what we call spontaneous achievement zones, which, with the case of Liza and Hans. Liza is a 7 years old novice. She only took 3 lessons so far. She also improvises at home several times a week on her own piano.
So an example of action that allows the learner to manage his improvisation, especially when they are so young, consists in validating what he plays. So if the teacher anchors his own performance in the learner's performance, then he set up a space of shared creation in which they can now communicate. Such a validation entails what we call a phase of synchrony, which means that teacher and learner are together in time, literally. They shape the musical temporality in a similar fashion. So to validate the learner's ongoing performance, the teacher possesses an array of techniques of synchrony, which are part of a larger repertoire of techniques of interaction. Techniques of interaction are pragmatical means by which a subject actively regulates the dynamics of the interaction itself. So it is when someone regulates or modulates the way the unfolding of the interaction is actually happening. So indeed, sensory-motor interaction between persons self-organize, which gives rise to collective dynamics in which individual behaviors get entangled. As a result of those interaction dynamics, individual behaviors get coordinated in time. There are many researches for a few years in the field of cognitive sciences that show that. This is at the very heart of what we want to show, so I will stress it and try to explain a little bit more what we have in mind when we say that interaction is coordinating people in time. I will take an example, very basic example. If you take the subway in a big city like Paris, it happens all the time. You're in the corridor, you cross the way of someone, so you want to avoid it because you know it's the Parisian subway, so you don't want to meet too much social beings. But the person is going in the same way as you. So you go the other way, and the person is doing the same thing, and etc., until you break. Until someone breaks this symmetry. This is an example that I borrow from Ezequiel Di Paolo and Anne de Jaeger. This is a basic example, but we can understand that in this interaction process, something is happening that makes people move in an opposite direction of their own intentions. They want to escape the interaction, but they are trapped in it. So I did many experiments, we did some and others did, and every time we find the same results. The process of interaction itself plays a great role, an important role in individual behaviors. So this is at the center of our thought, so I wanted to stress that a little bit. So because the teacher masters such dynamics, because he knows how to regulate them, thanks to its teaching experience, he can make use of their properties. So for instance, he can stabilize the movements of the learner, which now can rely on his movements, as well as on the very coordinative effects of the interaction itself. So this is why validation can entail a phase of synchrony and can stabilize and help the child to manage his improvisation. The child can rely on the interaction itself to perform. So, you know what they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but since I'm working with Ilan, I think that a child improvising music is worth at least a whole library. So we will listen to a few excerpts.
We are going to listen to the first excerpt. Liza plays a pattern while I validate her pulse and the notes she plays. We can hear a phase of synchrony arising, but the way, in all excerpts, the learner is always playing to the high register and the teacher in the low register. Sorry, but the sound is playing the other track. Our pedagogical system of I immediately observed that Liza has very anchored musical habits. This points out the existence of what we coined as spontaneous achievement zones. These zones are made of behavioral patterns that are played recurrently with ease and without any instruction to play them. These patterns manifest themselves as attractors toward which behavior is spontaneously pulled. Kelso, 1995. Liza's spontaneous achievement zone is so anchored that it keeps our relation from developing. Simon Dunn would say that her performance is oversaturated, hyperstable. Her pattern is indeed too rigid. It lacks flexibility, which is necessary for the unfolding of an interaction. Indeed, the communication process is always incomplete. The individual subject cannot possess the full control of its unfolding. He has to share the regulation of the interaction with other autonomous subjects. He has to cope with the ever-going complementarity of the others. Overall, there is no interaction as long as we aren't both behaving autonomously. So far, my actions do not really affect Liza's behavior. I thus cannot contribute autonomously to our collective effort. Therefore, we do not perform the music in a shared collective way. In the following excerpt, which happened a little bit later than the previous one, Liza is repeating her spontaneous pattern. She plays this melody of 3 or 4 notes since the first listen in every improvisation, whether she plays alone or interacts with me. Although I slow down the tempo in order to conclude the performance, she just keeps playing her pattern without making any change. We can hear that there isn't any interaction between us. You can hear that. Liza is just continuing playing his own pattern, and she didn't care of what I do. By navigating her spontaneous achievement zone, the learner individuates herself psychically in the couple with the instrument. Yet, she does not reach the collective level of individuation. The coupling between corporeal and technical organs is achieved, but it lacks the social dimension. Here, the level of the teacher-learner dyad. A learner can either get bored or keep being satisfied with his spontaneous achievement zone. Liza only took 3 listens so far, so that she didn't have enough time to get bored with it. Moreover, I haven't made her experience the attractivity of the dynamics of our interaction yet. On his side, Hans is a learner that shows signs of boredness and lack of creativity as a consequence of his spontaneous achievement zone. However, Hans takes lessons with me for 4 years, in the course of which he has been able to acquire interacting skills. He is thus able to communicate musically and to stay flexibly open to the effects of our encounter.
So we will now listen to the spontaneous achievement zone of Hans. It's a melodic march of 3 notes that he repeats in a descending way. In this improvisation, the teacher merely validates his performance. However, when the end of the march is reached, we won't hear that because we don't have the time, but when the end of the march is reached, Hans doesn't manage to bring forth novelties, despite the fact that he still wants to play with the teacher. He's continuing to play, but he's just starting over and over, a little bit like Laïsa. So he's expecting the help of the teacher to escape that pattern in which he seems to be trapped. And
The end is not the same.
it was another track. So he's repeating that, and he can't escape it. He achieved that spontaneously, but he can't escape it. Before we tackle this problem and how we solve it, we will go back a little bit to the conceptual side. So according to Bernard Stiegler in De la Misère Symbolique 1, primary retentions manifest themselves through the sieve of secondary retentions. So the lived experience of the subject is over-determined by its own memory. In cognitive science, this is something that is well accounted for by dynamical systems theories. Processes that are at play in our behaviors and experiences are not independent of each other. They don't add up, they actually multiply. By that I mean that they are coupled and interact with each other in a very complex way. According to Kelso, those interactions between processes constitute what he calls the intrinsic dynamics of the subject. Those dynamics form a non-uniform metastable background, metastable in the sense of Kelso, which orients behavioral tendencies toward attracting patterns. So it is actually the global form of this dynamical background and the very stability of zones of attraction that are modified by learning, as has been shown by Kostrubiak and colleagues 2012. So in some intrinsic dynamics of the subject shape his behaviors and experiences in a way that dynamically depends on the traces of past experiences. So that in this context we can distinguish between 2 types of retention. Stereotypical secondary retentions, which consolidate and anchor even more the tendencies that emerge from secondary retentions. So in dynamical systems terminology, it means that intrinsic dynamics are further stabilized by the practice of the patterns they actually encourage. So what we call spontaneous achievement zone are a direct consequence of such a stereotyping process. On the other hand, traumatypical secondary retentions bear on patterns that lie outside of regions of attractions in dynamical terminology. Their enactment can thus modify the overall dynamical background of the subject. So such retentions thus modify the existing configuration of secondary retention so that the subject self-differentiates. They thus give individuation an opportunity to happen. Stiegler de La Misère Symbolique 2. So in the next part, we will show that spontaneous tendencies or spontaneous achievement zones can hinder or mask deeper tastes, which we coin as core tastes. Core tastes are thus constituted through a differentiation with spontaneous tendencies.
Instead of validating what the learner plays, my role can consist in blocking the pattern he performs. This blocking action entails a phase of diachrony, which means that we aren't coordinated anymore. For instance, we no longer play with the same pulse, the same rhythms, and the same kind of gestures. Blocking allows to problematize the situation by disorganizing the motricity and the lived experience of the learner. I can thus show my autonomy to the learner. Yet, in order to keep the improvisation being involving and attractive to the learner, I have to block his performance in a way that does not just make sense for me, it also has to make sense for him, and more generally, it has to make sense in the dynamical context of our interaction. This way, our pedagogical device can encourage a process of psychic and collective individuations. I block Hans's performance by playing clusters of notes according to a rhythmical pattern that is different from his. This brings forth a new pulse that he validates by coordinating to it. A brand new phase of synchrony arises, but this time its construction has been actively shared. In this example, I strongly block his performance and propose a new rhythmical pattern, along with new kinds of gestures. Hans validates my proposition in turn, hence we enter a new phase of synchrony. Can hear France, which is really coordinated to me. Validate my proposition. Let's go back to Liza. Since I haven't managed to communicate with her, I explain her situation verbally. I propose her to differentiate her solo improvisations from our dyadic improvisations. We analyze her spontaneous achievement zone and then write it on a score so that she can exteriorize and distantiate herself from her own tendencies. The improvisation that we perform next shows signs of her understanding of the situation. She modifies her performance drastically. Thus, she now leaves room for the expression of my autonomy and thus for the expression of our interactive relation itself. Now, Lisa and the teacher are synchronizing to a pattern that does not belong to her spontaneous achievement zone. Pulse, rhythm, and gestures are radically different. She was playing legato, close to the piano, but now she performs with more stresses and with straight gestures. Together, they now perform a brand new kind of music. You recognize his past pattern. And integrated his own pattern, but transformed it to my pattern.
So we can feel the difference between a performance before and after the interaction. On this basis, the next two cases will allow us to differentiate between spontaneous achievement zones and core tastes. Overall, while a spontaneous achievement zone emerges from the intrinsic dynamics of the subject as coupled with the technical organ, core tastes exist in the articulation of intrinsic dynamics and relational dynamics. For us, relational dynamics designates the way the relation between what each of us do is evolving in time as an effect of the interaction itself. So core tastes express a way in which a subject can live an experience, but this very experience can only be lived as an effect of the interaction process, since the patterns that give rise to that experience cannot be reached out of the context of interaction. So core tastes thus represent a psychic and collective individuation. When a core taste is expressed, it can either negate spontaneous tendencies or exist along them. The example of another learner, Timothée, fits the first case. Although his spontaneous achievement zone is about pretty much everything that does not require precise coordination between his own limbs or with the teacher, his core taste actually aims at synchronicity. So Timothée core taste, we will listen to it now, is the synchronization of his limbs, unlike his spontaneous achievement zones. It was very stable.
The core taste of Alban is the regulation of the interaction itself. This core taste does not negate her spontaneous achievement zone, which is a very binary style with a moderate pulse played in a pentatonic mode. If she regulates our interaction, then that interaction exists upstream, which means that she had acknowledged my autonomy. In this example, she blocks my swing performance by playing longer notes. I validate her proposition, and thus we enter in a new phase of synchrony. Phases of diachrony with Alban are very short, since she has good interacting skills. Excuse me, wait. I'm going to... In this example, she... While spontaneous achievement zones are the result of well-managed coupling between the subject and his milieu, core taste features aspects of projection and desire. However, if the teacher blocks the spontaneous achievement zone immediately, the learner cannot actualize this potential, which will then be repressed and will persist in her future performances. The learner projects the unification of his retentional flow, either by making her spontaneous achievement zone flexible or by stabilizing her core taste. In other words, this unification implies the metastabilization of spontaneous achievement zone, tendencies to stereotypal behaviors, and core taste, tendencies to emancipate on one's own stereotypes.
So it is through his core taste that the subject can access the psychic and collective dimension of individuation. Allowing the learner to access his own core taste thus denotes the constitution of a proper system of care. The meaning that is individuated by the relation is consistent. It is the music that we shape together. The performed music, conceived as a technical organ, becomes an attractor for our behaviors and their relation. In other words, the unfolding of the performance orients the trajectory of our interacting behaviors. So these behaviors thus get attracted to behavioral regions that cannot be reached outside of an interaction. This has been showed by Frozo with artificial robots that have 4 neurons, for example. This is what encourages learners to prefer the realization of interactive relations with the teacher rather than the realization of their sole spontaneous tendencies. I think we don't have time anymore, so just one sentence. Je zappe tout, je vais la dernière. Oh, we had a lot. Okay, so by doing what we do, not only do we see how co-individuation can actually happen in the wild, in the real world. As a first step, we formalize it as the attracting effect of collective dynamics that emerge from interacting behaviors, and we formalize it with dynamical system theory. But we can also see why co-individuation is actually important for the individual subject who prefer to realize his interactive relation than his spontaneous tendencies. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.